the days of King Ahasuerus, who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, he held a grand banquet for all his officials and servants. On the 7th day, the king, merry with wine, ordered Queen Vashti to appear before him and his guests to display her beauty. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command. The king consulted his wise men about what should be done with Queen Vashti for her disobedience. It was decided that Queen Vashti would be removed from her position, and a decree was issued that all women should honor their husbands. The king's advisors suggested a search for beautiful young virgins throughout the empire, and the one who pleased the king would replace Vashti as queen. So the search began, and many young women were brought to the palace in Susa. Among them was Esther, a young Jewish woman who had been raised by her cousin Mordecai after her parents died. Esther found favor with Hegai, the eunuch in charge of the women. He quickly provided her with beauty treatments and special food. Esther received 12 months of beauty treatments, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. When Esther's turn came to go to the king, she requested nothing other than what Hegai advised. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. The king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she became queen in place of Vashti. During this time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate when he overheard 2 of the king's officers, Bigthana and Teresh, plotting to assassinate King Ahasuerus. Mordecai told Queen Esther of the plot, and she reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. An investigation was made, and the plot was confirmed. Bigthana and Teresh were hanged, and the incident was recorded in the Book of the Chronicles. After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the Agagite, to a position of great power and authority in the kingdom. The king commanded all royal officials at the gate to bow down and pay homage to Haman, but Mordecai refused. When Haman learned that Mordecai would not bow down or pay him homage, he was enraged. Driven by his hatred, Haman approached the king with a plan to destroy all the Jews in the empire, presenting them as a rebellious people. King Ahasuerus, unaware of Haman's true intentions, gave him his signet ring, allowing him to issue a decree in the king's name. Haman's decree ordered the destruction of all Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. When Mordecai learned of the decree, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, crying loudly. Esther's maids and eunuchs informed her of Mordecai's state, and she was deeply distressed. Esther sent clothes for Mordecai to wear, but he refused them. She then sent Hathach to find out the cause of his grief. Mordecai explained the decree and urged Esther to go to the king to beg for mercy for her people. Esther replied that approaching the king without being summoned could result in death unless he extended the golden scepter to her. Mordecai reminded her that she would not escape the fate of the Jews and suggested that she might have become queen for such a time as this. Esther resolved to approach the king, even at the risk of her life, and asked Mordecai to gather all the Jews in Susa to fast for her. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace, facing the king's hall. When the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out the golden scepter. Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The king asked her what she desired, offering up to half the kingdom. Esther invited the king and Haman to a banquet she had prepared, and the king agreed. At the banquet, the king again asked Esther what her petition was, promising to grant it. Esther requested that the king and Haman attend a second banquet the following day, where she would reveal her petition. Haman left the banquet in high spirits, but his mood soured when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, still refusing to bow. Haman's wife Zeresh and friends suggested building a gallows 75 feet high and asking the king to hang Mordecai on it. Haman was pleased with the idea and had the gallows built that night. That night, King Ahasuerus could not sleep, so he ordered the Book of the Chronicles to be read to him. As the records were read, the account of Mordecai's discovery of the plot to assassinate the king was brought to light. The king asked what honor Mordecai had received for this, and his attendants informed him that nothing had been done. Early the next morning, Haman entered the outer court to request permission to hang Mordecai. Before Haman could make his request, the king summoned him and asked how to honor someone the king delighted in. Haman, assuming the king intended to honor him, suggested an elaborate display, including royal robes, the king's horse, and a public proclamation. The king instructed Haman to do everything he suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sat at the king's gate. Haman, humiliated, had no choice but to obey. He led Mordecai through the streets, proclaiming the king's message. That evening, the king and Haman joined Esther for the second banquet. The king asked Esther once more what her petition was, assuring her it would be granted. Esther revealed her true request, the salvation of her people, the Jews, and exposed Haman as the enemy who plotted their destruction. The king, enraged by the revelation, left the banquet to compose himself in the palace garden. Haman, realizing the danger he was in, begged Esther for his life. When the king returned, he saw Haman falling on the couch where Esther was reclining, and interpreted it as an assault on the queen. One of the king's eunuchs, Harbona, informed the king of the gallows Haman had built for Mordecai. The king ordered Haman to be hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai, and so it was done. King Ahasuerus granted Esther and Mordecai the authority to issue a new decree to counteract the previous one. Mordecai drafted an edict allowing the Jews to assemble and protect themselves against any armed force that might attack them. The new decree was sent out by couriers on royal horses to all the provinces, bringing relief and hope to the Jews. When the Jews received the new decree, they rejoiced and celebrated, knowing they could now defend themselves. On the 13th day of Adar, the Jews assembled in their cities and defended themselves against those who sought to harm them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed 500 men, including the 10 sons of Haman, and hung their bodies on the gallows. Throughout the provinces, the Jews struck down 75,000 of their enemies, but did not lay hands on the plunder. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to all the Jews, establishing the 14th and 15th days of Adar as the festival of Purim. Purim was established as a time of feasting, joy, and giving gifts of food to one another and to the poor, celebrating their deliverance from destruction. Mordecai continued to serve King Ahasuerus with integrity and wisdom, becoming second in rank to the king and working for the good of his people. Queen Esther remained a beloved figure in the royal court and among her people, her story inspiring generations to come. The legacy of Esther and Mordecai is celebrated annually through the festival of Purim, a joyful reminder of their courage and faith.
Principles of uncommon favor, lessons from the book of Esther. The story of Esther in the Bible teaches us many lessons about God's special favor. Let's explore these principles and see how they relate to our lives today. Principle 1. Divine timing, Esther 2 verse 17. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Esther became queen at just the right time to save her people. This shows that God's timing is perfect. Sometimes, we may want things to happen quickly, but God knows the best time for everything. Principle 2. God's reversal of situations. Esther 7 verse 10. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. Haman wanted to hurt Mordecai, but God turned things around. Instead of Mordecai, Haman was punished. This teaches us that God can change bad situations and bring justice. Principle 3. Courage to act. Esther 4 verse 16. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Esther was brave. She decided to go to the king even though it was risky. This courage helped save her people. God wants us to be brave and do the right thing, even when it is hard. Principle 4. Importance of prayer and fasting. Esther 4 verses 15 to 16. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Before going to the king, Esther and her people prayed and fasted. This shows that asking God for help is important. When we face tough times, praying and fasting can give us strength and guidance. Principle 5. Wisdom and strategy. Esther 5 verse 8. "If the king regards me with favor and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." Esther invited the king and Haman to a banquet instead of telling her request immediately. She was wise and waited for the right moment. Using wisdom and making plans can help us succeed in what we do. Principle 6. God's favor brings elevation. Esther 8 verse 2. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Mordecai went from being a regular person to having great honor and responsibility. This shows that God's favor can lift us up to new places in life. God has big plans for each of us, and His favor can help us achieve great things. Principle 7. Remembering God's deliverance. Esther 9 verse 28. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family, and in every province and in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. The Jews celebrated their deliverance every year with the Feast of Purim. This helps us remember that God saves and helps His people. Celebrating and remembering what God has done helps us stay grateful. How to apply the principles of uncommon favor to your life today. 1. Trust in God's timing. Just like Esther, we should trust that God knows the best time for everything in our lives. Ecclesiastes 3 verse 1. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. 2. Believe in God's justice. God can turn any bad situation into something good. Romans 8 verse 28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. 3. Be courageous. God gives us strength to be brave and do what's right. Joshua 1 verse 9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. 4. Pray and fast. When we need help, praying and fasting can make us stronger and closer to God. Matthew 17 verse 21. But this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting. 5. Use wisdom. Making wise decisions and planning carefully can help us succeed. Proverbs 3 verses 5 to 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight. 6. Seek God's favor. God's favor can lift us up and give us new opportunities. Psalm 5 verse 12. Surely, Lord, you bless the righteous. You surround them with your favor as with a shield. 7. Celebrate and remember. It's important to remember and celebrate what God has done for us. Psalm 77 verse 11. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. By following these principles, we can experience God's favor just like Esther did. God's love and favor are available to everyone who trusts and believes in Him.